Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Hey everyone, this is Brian. For the next couple weeks, we will be featuring several speakers that presented at the Party for Socialism and Liberation Albuquerque branch's Southwest Socialism Conference. This week I am actually covering this from location in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And next week we will also include some of the speakers we weren't able to feature on this episode. So I hope you enjoy. These are organizers with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, reporting from the Southwest Socialism Conference, which took place this weekend in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
I want to welcome our first speaker of the day, Lillian House. Lillian is a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Denver, Colorado. They are going to be presenting on immigrant rights and the fight back against deportations and detention centers. Let's welcome Lillian.
We're currently in a moment of heightened awareness and struggle over immigration policy in the United States. This intensification was triggered by the discovery that part of Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy was to separate and detain children apart from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. Immediately, people recognized this policy for what it was, a deliberate and barbaric strategy for deterring people who are fleeing desperate circumstances from trying to enter the U.S. Videos and pictures surfaced, as well as testimony from inside detention centers of horrific treatment and neglect inflicted on migrant adults and children alike by ICE and Border Patrol agents. Nursing babies ripped from their mothers, toddlers locked up in cages, children drugged, abused, and made to fend for themselves in court. This cruel policy sheds light on the absurdity of rhetoric from the corporate media that criticizes immigrants for not coming in the legal way. Many of the families split apart, in fact, tried to enter the U.S. through the legal mechanisms in place for refugees, but were denied entry and criminalized when they presented themselves after crossing the border. For many people in this country, this has been a revelation of the terroristic capacities of the American state. Social media absolutely erupted with outrage. Even significant elements of Trump's base condemned the cruelty of these practices. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets and gathered in city centers and at local ICE facilities and detention centers across the country to demonstrate our opposition. The Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as the Answer Coalition, has been at the front line of these protests, not only in the Southwest, but across the country. Protests in Portland captured national attention when hundreds of demonstrators showed up at the local ICE office and refused to let employees leave. The ICE employees pleading to be let through to their cars drew a sharp irony as they complained that they needed to get home to their families. A number of protesters set up camp outside the building and demanded the permanent closure of the facility. Similar encampments sprung up at ICE facilities across the country, including in New York, Detroit, LA, Philadelphia, and other cities. President Trump issued an executive order in response to the public outcry, supposedly changing his administration's policy. But the order merely states that the updated policy is to, quote, maintain family unity, including by detaining alien families together where appropriate and consistent with law and available resources. To take this as a victory would require us to accept the continued abuse and detention of immigrants, granted that it's inflicted on them as family units. And even that is not guaranteed. Of course, the deportation machine we see today was not built by Trump. The militarization of the border and the extensive deportation agencies are products of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, and both major parties and their corporate backers have long accepted such inhumanity as the price of U.S. global supremacy. This is not even to mention this country's long tradition of separating children from their families, from the shores of Africa, at slave markets, Native American children sent to boarding schools, the mass incarceration of poor people and people of color. So yes, Trump is a disgusting racist, but to make this about one individual or one party exonerates the entire class of corporations and owners that collude in the terrorism abroad and at the border that enables them to make their profits.
That's right.
This capitalist class has built its wealth off the backs of the world's poor and oppressed, and they rely on the American state to maintain their system of exploitation by any means necessary. The sudden media spotlight also neglects the cause of the majority of migration across the U.S.-Mexico border. In South and Central America alone, the U.S. has made over 56 military interventions. Through violently suppressing people's movements, imposing sanctions and blockades, assassinating threatening activists and politicians, backing fascists, and training and arming opposition groups, the United States terrorizes Latin America to maintain its global dominance and its access to cheap labor and resources. Then, when the consequences show up at the border in the form of refugees, the state cages them or turns them away to die, or lets a certain number in, only to be demonized and given access to the lowest quality housing, education, and work opportunities. So clearly our fight cannot stop here. There are still hundreds of children that have not been returned to their parents, and the system that ceaselessly produces refugees and oppresses immigrants is still in place. We're inspired and encouraged by the massive protests that have swept the country, and we cannot let this energy be co-opted back into the Democratic Party, into the same system responsible for these atrocities. We've seen how they use immigrant lives as bargaining chips in their internal struggles for power, as in their shameful failure to advocate for DACA recipients. At best, they can offer more humane detention centers, measured deportations, and softer military interventions. We need to organize our own party, one of and by working people, that will fight for real justice in our communities. We must continue the fight to keep families together, but it can't just mean jail them together. And when we call to abolish ICE, that has to mean the full abolition of the detention and deportation machine.
That's right.
Ultimately, the entire capitalist system has to go. We fight for a future where instead of spending billions of dollars on warfare, militarizing the border, and caging families, the enormous wealth of this country can be used to guarantee the basic needs of every person, regardless of where they were born. We need socialism, and we must organize to make our demands real. No more detentions, no more deportations, no war, and full rights for immigrants. Thank you.
Next, we will be hearing from a local organizer of our Albuquerque branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Karina Rogers. She will be presenting on the ecological crisis and environmental struggles of the Southwest. Please welcome Karina.
So, for centuries, water has dictated and shaped the lives of people living in the harsh and demanding conditions of the desert. From the use of sacred springs by the Pueblos to the democratic and self-governing system of the acequias by the Spanish, harnessing water in the desert has shaped spirituality, cultural identities, and social systems in New Mexico. The use of this precious and limited resource requires innovation, cooperation, and planning. Today, the use of water is no longer focused to meet the basic needs of our daily lives or provide for the lives of our future generations. It is focused and driven toward immediate profit. Under our current system, there is no planning, there is no real positive innovation, and there is no cooperation on behalf of the government. Under capitalism, water is no longer a source of life, it is a commodity that is becoming more and more scarce. As our most precious resource begins to dry up in front of our eyes from the effects of climate change, the struggle for water and the certainty of our future becomes ever more precarious. With New Mexico quickly becoming a center of this country's military-industrial complex, thousands came pouring into the state for new economic opportunities, which quickly led to the over-allocation of the Rio Grande, New Mexico's main water source. In order to supplement the influx of growth, water was diverted from indigenous and Latino agricultural communities to rapidly growing urban centers, which is still a very common scenario today. Through arduous court battles and the buying and selling of water rights, Puebloans and Latinos still often end up on the losing side. For example, the city of Rio Rancho, initially a suburb of Albuquerque, continues to develop at an alarming and unsustainable rate. To supplement this growth, Rio Rancho has been buying off water rights from the farmers of Jemez and Zia pueblos. Capitalizing on the poverty within the pueblos, Rio Rancho has been offering significant sums to buy up water rights, and with farmers not yielding enough money from their crops, they often have no other options than to sell and move away from their ancestral homes to the city to seek better opportunities. With the ever-growing fossil fuel industry, military, and nuclear research labs here in New Mexico, there are hundreds of examples of water contamination throughout the state. The majority of these contamination sites surround impoverished communities and communities of color in a clear display of environmental racism. From oil and gas fracking groundwater contamination surrounding impoverished indigenous communities in northwestern New Mexico, to the 3 EPA Superfund sites in the historically Latino center of South Valley, a result of the dumping of toxic waste by military giants like the national laboratories. Then there is Kirtland Air Force Base itself, where jet fuel leaked into the aquifer of Albuquerque undetected for 45 years, resulting in the largest toxic contamination of an aquifer in U.S. history. It's been 24 years since the discovery of the spill, and only a gallon of water has been treated. As more of our water is being funneled into industry and growth and spewed back out as toxic waste, our options for clean and accessible water are growing thin, especially in the face of climate change. As it is, New Mexico is in exceptional drought, and groundwater is depleting fast across the state. With no rain to rely on and the pressure of climate change being felt, the state has been strife with water conflicts, most notably the current lawsuit between Texas and New Mexico over their share water of the Rio Grande. The two states have spent millions in legal fees in a heated and monumental battle that has pitted people against each other over a river that is quickly disappearing. While this is happening, corporations like Intel and Facebook suck thousands of gallons of water a day, and cities continue to outgrow their water rights, while the people suffer in an increasingly dry and warming environment. We are facing a crisis. It is not a crisis at the hands of the people, though. It is a crisis caused by capitalism. Lack of planning, deliberate negligence, exploitation, and mismanagement of our natural resources is how capitalism functions. Capitalism puts profit before all else, even human life, which is why we see water rights being taken from the people, but not from the corporations. It is why millions of our tax dollars are being wasted on lawsuits, millions of dollars that could be used for education, housing, employment, and healthcare. Capitalism commodifies life itself. It creates its own environmental crises with no real solutions. Who are the ones who are punished for this? Who are the ones who suffer from this? We do, the people. We are led to believe that we are the ones causing the water crisis, and we are pitted against one another in a battle that is not of our making. We are the ones who are punished for it with fines, hikes in yearly irrigation fees, and the loss of water rights. We cannot rely on the Republicans or the Democrats because they benefit from a capitalist system. As long as there is profit to be made, our rights will always be stolen, commodified, and privatized. The needs of the people will never be respected and will never be placed before profit. There are two sides to this battle. It is not Texas versus New Mexico. It is the people versus capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade, for that talk. Our next presenter is Marcus Nels, an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Albuquerque branch. He will be presenting on the U.S. war on native land and people. Please welcome Marcus.
Yate, Marcus Neljanisha, Maidesh Gijni Nishle, Ushia Bashishti, Torba and Dashache, Bitahni Dashanella. Hello, my name is Marcus Nels. I am from rural New Mexico. I belong to the Navajo Nation in the Southwest. I grew up in a border town next to the Zuni Pueblo and Navajo reservations. New Mexico's Navajo reservation came into existence when the people who were returning from the long walk decided to stay rather than continue back to the desert allotment in Arizona, where the main reservation was allotted by the U.S. Cavalry. The Long Walk was one of many military roundups of indigenous people to clear the land for settler colonialization in the region. From northern Arizona to southern New Mexico, the Navajo people walked about 300 miles with no aid from their captors. Many indigenous tribes in the Southwest faced similar consequences after intense resistance and revolts. At the founding of the U.S. Empire, the indigenous population paid with its blood, and the imperialist empire we know today is built on the continued suffering of my people on this land. From the colonization by Spain in 1492 to the counter-revolution of 1776, otherwise known as the American Revolution, Native Americans were the target of genocide. From 1776 to 1865, slavery and land dispossession of Native and Black people created the basis for the formation of the United States, all of which was justified by the colonizers using the racist doctrine of manifest destiny. From the building of the Transcontinental Railroad to the Western expansion, colonizers slaughtered the indigenous people of America for resource extraction and to wipe out all trace of their existence. From cultural and traditional life of many indigenous people was forcefully erased. The Canadian government used residential schools, like the U.S. boarding school, to separate children from families, suppress indigenous languages, violently assimilate native populations. For over 500 years, the United States has been at war with the indigenous people of America. In 2016, American Indians and Alaskan Natives were recorded at being 26.6% impoverished, which is the highest of any race group in the United States. As consequence, many indigenous people on and off the reservation continue to struggle with addiction, which we must understand is a symptom of the ongoing national oppression. Contrary to popular belief, majority of Native people are increasingly a part of urban working class and live in cities due to lack of jobs and higher education opportunities on the reservations. Native American reservations are being forced to sell their mineral rights and underground resources to major corporations in order to stay afloat in a failing capitalist economy. Many tribal governments has tossed aside their own interests of their own communities in order to make a quick buck in a capitalist society. On reservations, oil and mining companies have extracted vast amounts of resources while only paying a small fraction of the profits back to the people living in those areas. Those major mining and extraction companies have never compensated communities for the devastating detriments of the health of communities and the integrity of the land. Uranium mining has been a staple of wealth for the military-industrial complex for many years in New Mexico. Multiple Pueblo tribes and Navajo people were unknowingly exposed to dangerous amounts of radiation from dust sediments and water contamination. The most outrageous catastrophe that has happened in the Southwest is the Redwater Pond uranium spill near Church Rock, New Mexico in 1979. This is the greatest high-level radioactive spill in the country's history and the third largest in the world after Chernobyl and Fukushima. On many reservations across North America, indigenous tribes have been forced into similar circumstances. In 2016, the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline in South Dakota was an eruption from many years of continued oppression. No DAPL was the second largest movement of modern Native American history that united many Native tribes and other communities across the United States. The U.S. government continues to not uphold land treaties and allows corporations to do as they please, resulting in environmental catastrophes. The United States government does not recognize the self-determination of Native nations. In the history of Native resistance, AIM, the American Indian Movement, was founded in 1968 as a revival of spiritual traditions and political struggle. AIM created the first Indian urban-based healthcare system in the United States. They also led a march on Washington, D.C. to occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the Nixon administration and held a 71-day occupation of Wounded Knee against U.S. armed forces to end corruption in both the BIA and tribal governments. Both AIM and No DAPL sparked a political awareness in many Native communities, showing that resistance has always been a very strong core of indigenous culture in America. Violence by the U.S. government has not only been unleashed upon indigenous and black people here, but also abroad. After years of experience in homegrown terrorism, the U.S. military started expanding its terror into South America, Asia, and Africa. After World War II, the United States flexed its power in a war-torn world by seizing old imperialist control of oppressed and colonized nations. Much like the indigenous population in America, third world countries continue to resist U.S. imperialism. A common thread has been woven into oppressed people of the world. The horrific experiences shared together has created the basis for multinational unity for the creation of a better society, a socialist society. Socialism calls for the end to this imperialist system that continues to oppress indigenous people across the world. Socialism calls for an end to mining and extraction on native lands and seizing the assets that these companies use for cleanup. Socialism calls for the end of poverty, for basic human necessities to be met for all people. Only socialism can begin to address the centuries of injustices and damages caused to the Native nations in a tangible way. Socialism calls for political, economical, and cultural independence for Native nations. Socialism would mean self-determination and sovereignty for Native nations and all oppressed nations. This is why I fight for socialism. This is why I'm a socialist. Thank you.
I would now like to welcome our next speaker, Stephen Levin. Stephen is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Phoenix, Arizona. He first got involved with activism in 2006 during the white shirt protests for immigrant rights. Stephen will be presenting on the rapidly growing service industry and the conditions that low-wage workers today face. Please welcome Stephen.
I'd like to start by thanking the Albuquerque branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation for all their hard work in organizing this amazing conference, hosting all of us, and being a light of hope for workers' struggle in what we call the U.S. Southwest. This conference is firmly rooted within the tradition of centuries of struggle in what we call the U.S. Southwest, and it is an honor to be here and to be asked to give this talk. I was floored when I was asked to give this talk because I have no traditional qualifications. I'm a dishwasher, and I make minimum wage. I work in a hot, dirty kitchen where I and my coworkers are not asked for our thoughts, hopes, or desires. I don't have years of schooling, a college degree, a talent for theory, or any other special qualifications. I am merely one worker out of so many millions who believes that we cannot go on as we have, who sees the contradictions daily, and who wishes to do something about the fact that very many of us work so hard for so little and with no guarantee of health, housing, or comfort. The PSL is composed of many workers just like me, and I remain so grateful to have a voice, to be considered more than just unskilled labor, and to be able to be a part of the movement that is fighting for the socialism which will eventually give us workers the things that we deserve in life. As a part of PSL, I am going to be presenting on the service industry and its unique issues and injustices. We are seeing a growing trend in the workforce. The economy is being restructured. Machines are replacing industrial jobs by the thousands. This is leading to a reorientation of the workforce where workers are being pushed into a fast-growing service industry. Huge parts of what we would have been considered middle-class jobs are now being replaced with low-wage service industry jobs, essentially eliminating the so-called middle class. Even the majority of jobs created under the Obama administration were part-time service industry jobs that did not provide any benefits or protections. In recent years, the service industry has been the sector of the workforce where we have seen militant struggles for unions, higher wages, and better working conditions. The service industry includes a variety of jobs, ranging from hotel workers to food and retail, to teachers and healthcare workers. This sector of the working class holds one of the greatest potentials for organizing and to fight back. So, what are the features of this huge sector of the working class? When mainstream historians speak of labor history, they speak of it when they speak of it at all. They tell us that labor struggles in the previous centuries won us the 8-hour day. Anyone who has ever worked in the service industry knows that for the most part, the 8-hour day is indeed history. Yeah. Whether it is getting insufficient hours at one job and needing to pick up 1, 2, or 3 extra jobs just to break even, or working incredibly long and hard shifts in order to have enough money to pay for basic necessities, workers are being exploited day in and day out. The thought of guaranteed health care, sick days, paid vacations, and maternity or paternity leave is still a dream to most in the service industry. Many workers in the food industry are forced to show up for work while sick, because for workers living paycheck to paycheck, missing a shift is simply not an option. The gains supposedly won for all workers by the brave struggles of the labor movement are continuously being rolled back, and for large parts of the workforce, these gains were never won at all. It is no secret that the division of labor in the Southwest is extremely racialized, and in most areas, the backbone of the service industry workforce is made up of immigrants and other oppressed peoples. While the more lucrative front-of-house jobs typically go to Anglo workers, the more dangerous jobs, like hot and dirty kitchen jobs, are typically only given to workers from oppressed nationalities. Intentionally, division is created between workers within the same workplace by employers. Consequently, pervasive racism and wage gaps are used to restrict workers from uniting to fight for better working conditions. The threat of deportation or termination keeps many undocumented workers afraid to speak up against the poor working conditions. Overt exploitation of immigrant labor all across the service industry is more the rule than the exception. And in areas like ours, where large parts of the population are composed of immigrant, indigenous, and other nationally oppressed peoples, the mechanisms of oppression are that much more severe. It is easy to see how this climate of fear works to benefit bosses and owners of the businesses that exploit our labor. The history of union busting in the Southwest continues to make workplace organizing more and more difficult. Right-to-work laws, specifically crafted to benefit the owners and bosses and to prevent unionization, have dealt severe blows to any sort of labor struggle in our region. Capitalists' ability to terminate an employee for no stated reason create a climate of fear where many workers are afraid to even bring up the word union, let alone talk about actually organizing one. Despite this, and even in the face of anti-worker laws, we are seeing change on the horizon. Earlier this year in my state, Arizona, an unprecedented workout by teachers and students demanded better pay and better funding, led to tens of thousands of teachers to walk out. To bring attention to their plight. These teacher strikes in Arizona and across the country are a sign that our movement is growing in strength and support. Under conditions like these that we face as service workers, it sometimes seems far too easy to see our situation as hopeless and to feel we will remain a permanent underclass at the mercy of the greed and cruelty of the capitalist class in their courts, police, and migra. However, history has shown that it is precisely the people that have the power to change the situation for the better. For hundreds of years, all across the world, workers just like us have banded together, said enough, and organized to make life livable for our families and ourselves. History has also shown that our victory is inevitable if we persevere, organize, sacrifice, and agitate. We must never forget that workers make society function. We plant, harvest, cook, feed, and clean up after the entire population. Our labor is not only lowly, it is essential, and without us nothing would function. It is the labor and stolen wages of the working class that creates all profits for the capitalist class. We are the engine of history, and it is time to take the controls and steer it for ourselves. A better world is possible, and it is up for us to win it. I believe that we can, and I believe that we will, comrades. Service workers hold more power than anyone can ever imagine, and workers' power is the only thing that can bring us socialism. Let's organize to make our power known.
Next, we will be hearing from Josh Castillo. Josh is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Las Cruces, New Mexico. A few weeks ago, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party voted to increase the military budget by another $18 billion. Josh will be presenting on the role of military expansion in the Southwest and its consequences. Please welcome Josh.
2 weeks ago, some of my comrades and I made a trip to Tularosa, New Mexico, which is just outside of Alamogordo, to attend a vigil that was held to acknowledge the negative and deadly health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico from the Trinity test. Around 900 names of people who have lost their lives to cancer were read aloud and honored. In some cases, entire generations of families have been wiped out due to the exposure from the Trinity test radioactive fallout. Many of the survivors have never received federal assistance or compensation for the disaster that these people were unjustly faced with. For people who don't know, the Trinity test was the first ever detonation of a nuclear weapon, and it was conducted by the United States Army on July 16, 1945 at 5:29 a.m. in the Jornada del Muerto Desert as part of the Manhattan Project. Communities like Tularosa that were downwind of the testing site were exposed to poisonous atomic ash that rained down from the sky. Due to the top secret nature of the nuclear development going on in the country, the testing of the atomic bomb was not made public, nor was anyone in the neighboring towns warned that a nuclear explosion would take place just miles away from their homes. The people were even lied to weeks after the detonation took place. The United States would go on to drop atomic bombs similar to the one detonated at the Trinity test site on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan on August 6 and 9, 1945. The Southwest region is not unfamiliar with nuclear activity. We were part of the uranium mining boom that fueled nuclear development during the Cold War, and we currently house the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the country. Nevada has a similar history of being used as a playground for the government's testing of nuclear weapons. Increases of various cancers were reported from the mid-1950s through 1980 in areas around the Southwest as a result of these nuclear tests. Here in New Mexico, U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich has made clear his support for welcoming a new nuclear age by securing $40 million to modernize infrastructure at the White Sands Missile Range and is using $361 million to fund plutonium research at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. They say that expanding the nuclear weapon industry will create jobs and opportunity for the people of New Mexico, but we know that this will only funnel massive amounts of wealth into the hands of only a handful of investors and leave the poor struggling to survive, as so many already do, not only in the state, but in the United States, across the country. The Obama administration authorized a nuclear modernization program that was estimated to cost $1 trillion over the next 30 years. The current administration is on track to make sure this continues. Make no mistake, this is all meant as a way to make the idea of nuclear activity more palpable to the public again, as we see the ruling class gear up for confrontation with Russia, Iran, and China. We need only to look at history to know that the consequences of nuclear war are devastating. The United States' current nuclear inventory, with our over 4,000 nuclear warheads, has the power to completely obliterate any nation and spread destruction across the world. More recently, several proposals have been put forth to the state of New Mexico in the way of welcoming this new nuclear age. Los Alamos National Laboratory, most notable for creating the first atomic bomb, is expanding its nuclear plutonium pit production. Pits are the core of atomic bombs that are responsible for the first and most severe explosive stage of nuclear weapon detonation, and they can last for about 150 years if left unused. Another proposal on the table is designating southeast New Mexico between Hobbs and Carlsbad a dump site for all of the nation's radioactive waste for years to come. Not only would this pose an extreme health risk to the workers at the waste facility and to the communities in the area who risk exposure, but to the environment as well. The nuclear fuel and waste management company Holtec International's proposal was recently accepted by the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission, licensing the project to begin construction and operation by 2022. No one can guarantee that the radioactive waste at the site will not leak. No one can guarantee that the transportation of this waste will reach the facility safely. So they see New Mexico as a wasteland that can be used as a dump site for all of the nation's highest level radioactive material and ignore the fact that we are one of the poorest states in the country with large populations of people of color and indigenous lands and communities. This is environmental racism. We've seen time and time again that when an environmental disaster occurs, it's always the poor and most marginalized people who pay the price. Instead of providing health care, education, adequate housing to meet the people's needs, the ruling class is instead funding this country's billion-dollar military budget, something that has the support of both the Democrat and Republican parties. Why is it okay for the U.S. to continue to build its nuclear arsenal while demanding other countries disarm theirs? They say that these weapons of mass destruction are a deterrent to protect the United States, but who is the only country to ever use nuclear weapons in the first place? Right. We demand an end to the outrageous military budget that keeps expanding year after year to the tune of $82 billion in taxpayer money. We demand an end to the production of nuclear weapons and the disarmament of the United States' nuclear arsenal. The people of the United States and the people of the world do not want war. Only the billionaire ruling class, who profits from arms manufacturing and nuclear development, have a stake in endless war. If we wish to truly have peace, live in a healthy and sustainable environment, we must change the system that does nothing but extract the world's resources, pollutes the environment, and exploits workers. We must continue to stand with the people of the countries that are in the U.S.'s crosshairs against imperialist domination and aggression, and we here in the belly of the beast must continue to organize against our own ruling class and fight for socialism. Thank you.
For our final speaker of our first plenary class struggle in the Southwest, we will be hearing from Maura Casados Cassidy. Maura is a member with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Denver, Colorado. She will be presenting on the historic teachers' revolt, the U.S. war on education, and the impacts of privatization. Let's welcome Maura.
All right. Thank you, folks, for having me here. What a pleasure to be up here on stage with y'all. Earlier this year, we witnessed an unprecedented wave of teacher uprisings around the country, beginning in West Virginia and spreading here to the Southwest. I want to talk briefly about the policies that led to this fight back, the nature of this uprising, and how, as socialists, we can support and intervene in this movement. So a little bit about myself. I'm a high school teacher in Denver, Colorado, and a union member. Denver is a city that has the unfortunate distinction of being a pioneer for many of the destructive, racist, and classist neoliberal school reforms that have been carried out in the U.S. In the recent decades. Over the past 4 years, I've become increasingly active in educators' unions, like many teachers, because of the intolerable working and learning conditions that we face every day. A poll earlier this year showed that 3 in 4 Americans, regardless of their politics, believe that teachers are underpaid. It's not a surprise, right? This wave of actions and strikes is a clear sign that many education workers are at a breaking point. It is noteworthy that the fight back has emerged in states which are considered conservative or inhospitable to labor activity. States like West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Colorado. In other words, it is the severity of the conditions that has driven this movement. I have a coworker whose husband was recently laid off. When she realized that it would cost almost half her monthly paycheck to insure just her 3 children, not herself, she broke down crying in the teacher's lounge. She's already working 2 jobs, and she's taken in renters to help pay her mortgage. We buy our own toilet paper and soap. We're micromanaged by legislators and corporate stooges who have no idea about education or no experience in the classroom. We are expected to work unlimited overtime, and we do it with a smile on our face to make schools safe, fun for every kid. What we're seeing across the country right now are the devastating results of decades of defunding private and privatizing public education. Charter school networks, education testing companies, and even companies like Amazon are making billions of dollars from this process. The teaching profession is deliberately being turned into a high turnover, low skill, and low paying job as teachers' unions are attacked and charter schools replace comprehensive community schools. And programs like Teach for America replace skilled union teachers. Here are some statistics from Colorado, my state. The majority of schools in Colorado have switched to a 4-day school week for budgetary concerns. Since 2009, teachers' salaries have actually decreased 15.6%, and almost half of teachers leave the classroom in their first 5 years. Denver Public Schools alone has about a 20% turnover rate every year. And you can imagine the consequences in the classroom, right? The policies that have created these conditions are absolutely bipartisan in nature and promoted by Democrats and Republicans alike. Denver, a city controlled by the Democrats, has allowed its students to act as guinea pigs for the so-called portfolio approach to school choice. This is an experiment in school reform championed by the neoliberal Dream Team, the Obama administration, the Gates Family Foundation, and the Walton Foundation. Yeah. Denver's school policy basically favors charter schools and so-called innovation schools over traditional community schools. That means these schools do not have to recognize contracts won by the teachers union, and they're basically free to pick and choose what students they want. So we've gone from having 17 comprehensive community high schools in Denver, those are schools with orchestras, with career teachers, with football teams, to having only 3. And you can guess which neighborhoods those 3 comprehensive schools are left in, by the way. It's not neighborhoods of color, right? In the monopoly stage of capitalism, markets are saturated and growth slows. So this motivates the privatization of public goods in order to provide new profit streams for parasitic capitalists at the expense of providing education to everyone. But as these forces bear down on workers, it has only increased our collective will to fight back. The Facebook group behind the West Virginia teachers' strike grew to 73,000 members in 4 days. And the success, yeah, right? The success of that wildcat strike in Arizona or in West Virginia created a domino effect, emboldening teachers hundreds of miles away to stand up against their own poor working conditions. In Colorado, the walkouts we saw in the spring grew from 1 school district to virtually every district in the state in 2 days. And these actions have been met by overwhelming support in their respective communities. In West Virginia, striking teachers distributed breakfast and lunch to children who depend on free lunch programs to eat. In Denver and Arizona, tens of thousands took to the streets in support of teachers. But the fight is not over. Denver teachers, for example, are poised to strike in January if we cannot come to an agreement about teacher compensation. So, as teachers know, the problems of the world do not stop at the schoolhouse door. But as the past year has shown, our collective power does not stop there either. I am both a teacher and a socialist, and yeah. And as a socialist, right, we not only support these worker struggles, but we aim to broaden the impact of this movement by drawing connections between the attacks on public education and other issues like gentrification, racist policing, poverty wages, and imperialism. The only solution to these intertwined problems is a system that values human needs over profit. Yes. I want a safe, humane, and fair future for the young people that I teach, and we need socialism.
Hi, everybody. My name is Satyavati. I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Albuquerque. I work in the service industry, and I'm also a student at a community college here. This yellow sheet has a message of solidarity with Colombia that is suffering U.S.-backed right-wing violence right now. So I'm going to be inviting James Jordan up to the stage. He's an organizer with the Alliance for Global Justice, and James has a message of solidarity. He's also going to lead some chants. So after James finishes speaking, please hold up this yellow sign above your heads like this. but not upside down, the right way up. And we're going to snap a photo with all of us holding the sign up, and we want to send that to activists in Colombia. So, James, please come to the stage.
I want to begin just by saying a few words in Spanish directly to our comrades in Colombia. Saludos, camaradas. Muchas veces cuando hemos visitado en su hermoso país, nos han dicho que lo que quieren el más de nosotros en los Estados Unidos es que cambiemos nuestro propio país. Y quiero decir que en este momento estamos unas pocas horas de donde está encarcelado el héroe y preso político colombiano en los Estados Unidos, Simón Trinidad. Y queremos primero declarar nuestro deseo por su liberación y repatriación en Colombia. Quiero decir que estamos acá hablando de la liberación de los Estados Unidos, de los pueblos de los Estados Unidos, y cómo podamos construir el socialismo. Su lucha es vinculado a nuestra. Peleamos para su liberación y por nuestra liberación, porque somos todos y todas camaradas de corazón. Y saludos, declaramos la solidaridad con ustedes. In late November 2016, peace accords were finalized to end more than 52 years of civil war in Colombia, a civil war that was begun, that was suggested, that was urged on, has been advised and funded every step of the way by the United States government. In that civil war, more than 220,000 people have lost their lives, 92,000 people have been disappeared, and there are 7.7 million displaced persons. The situation was already deplorable. But since that peace process, or since the final year that the peace process was negotiated in 2016, and up until now, close to 400 popular movement leaders have been assassinated. This is a campaign of extermination specifically against leftists, against workers, against campesinos. It is especially targets Afro-Colombians, indigenous Colombians, and the situation has just gotten much, much worse. On June 17th, a right-wing president, Iván Duque, was elected, and he will take office on August 7th. Since his election, popular movement leaders, ex-insurgents, ex-political prisoners, and their families have been being killed at a rate of more than one per day. It is necessary that worldwide we stand in solidarity, and that's why this week, across the world, throughout Colombia, throughout North America, South America, Europe, Australia, around the world, people are organizing demonstrations and acts of solidarity to let Duque know from day one that we demand that the peace for Colombia be honored. Again, the U.S. is responsible for this war. We poured $12 billion into funding war and repression in Colombia. Trump has pushed policies that reject the peace accords and undermine them in every way. But Colombia, too, is not just a victim of oppression. It is a key to repression in the world, and it could be a key to liberation in the world. Colombia has, in the strangest of circumstances, become a member of the North American Treaty Organization of NATO and is now a permanent presence for NATO in Latin America. It has become part and parcel its oligarchy and government of the U.S. NATO transnational corporate empire. It has provided trainings to military and police personnel around the world, more than 30,000 people, more than half of them in Mexico. And it has sent troops with the United States to patrol West African sea and airspace. It has sent troops to fight and advise in Afghanistan and Yemen. That's why we say that the peace of Colombia is peace for Colombia is peace for the world. So that's what I'd like to ask everybody to do, just to stand and be part of this nationwide, worldwide act of solidarity that is happening around the world, to hold up these signs, to show our solidarity with our dear comrades in Colombia, and say together, peace for Colombia is peace for the world. 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 Thank you.
Thank you, James. The world we live in is not simply divided along the lines of workers and bosses, but also along the lines of oppressor and oppressed nations, into economically developed nations and underdeveloped nations. Underdeveloped because of the legacy of colonialism. The orientation of the developed West towards the underdeveloped nations that are struggling to achieve economic development in a world dominated by capitalist economic relations is still very much the same. It is a relationship based on racist domination and oppression. The PSL unconditionally stands with oppressed nations fighting against imperialism and for independence. Sometimes, U.S. foreign policy can seem hard to understand because corporate news always tells us that crises in other countries are caused by ethnic conflict or cultural conflict or as an age-old conflict with its roots nowhere to be found. But we can understand it. U.S. foreign policy can be understood if we know that it is being organized and driven by the rich in the interests of the rich, who ruthlessly pursue their interests. Endless wars, military interventions under the guise of humanitarianism, manufactured famines, economic strangulation using sanctions, and isolation are all weapons used by the U.S. and NATO powers to maintain their control over nations that rebel and refuse to surrender their resources, and their population to be used as cheap labor or their markets. For the nations oppressed by imperialism, economic hardship and strained democratic structures are not features inherent to an inability to uplift their own conditions, but they're rather a consequence of imperialism, which forces these nations to allocate their already limited resources disproportionately towards the military, when they would rather use that money towards the betterment of their societies. That's how we can explain U.S. foreign policy, or what the PSL calls U.S. imperialism. Imperialism drives oppressed nations that fight back up against the wall and into a constant state of defense against attack. At home, the corporate media and politicians that serve the U.S. ruling class fuel racist lies and misinformation about these countries to pit exploited workers here against oppressed people abroad. What they will never tell us about Cuba is that it has one of the most democratic electoral processes in the world, or that the United Nations World Health Organization believes Cuba's free healthcare system to be an example for all countries of the world. They will never tell us that poverty in Venezuela, which has a significant population of African descent, has reduced from 43% to 26%, or that illiteracy has been eradicated since the Bolivarian Revolution began in 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez. The media continues to disingenuously report on Iran's nuclear weapons program when what Iran has ever had is a nuclear energy program. They somehow always forget to mention that the DPRK, what is said in the news to be North Korea, has free education through university or that homelessness is non-existent there. All of these countries are fighting for economic independence and are paying a price for upholding political independence. All people are exploited as workers, but not all are only exploited as workers. There are groups of people who are oppressed on the basis of their nationality. We see every day the many ways in which people of oppressed nationalities are dehumanized by the media and the ruling class here in the US. Natives, Black people, Latinos, Asians, and others are the primary targets of state-sponsored violence in this country. The racist U.S. foreign policies are only complementary to the racist immigration and law enforcement policies here at home. Oppressed people across the world are linked through our united struggle against world enemy number one, which is U.S. imperialism. We know that the corporate media lies. We know that when we turn on the news, we hear lies. So what is the truth?
That was yet another organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation from the Southwest Socialism Conference, which is held this weekend in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was reporting live from the location. I was there on scene, rather, not necessarily live. Hope you enjoyed. If you want to learn more about the Party for Socialism and Liberation, you can visit their website at pslweb.org. Once again, that's pslweb.org. That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.